It's now time for our panel discussion, and that's going to be chaired by Minister Scott Simpson, who's the Associate Environment Minister. And our panellists will be Dr. William Rolleston, the President of Federated Farmers, Mike Jebson, Chief Executive of QEII Trust, and Ngaire Tyson from Landcare Trust. And they're going to be discussing the opportunities and challenges of recovery of threatened species on private land.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and what an interesting day, in fact, couple of days that you've all had. I've come from the Parliament, where I've been granted leave by the all-powerful whips, who are the people that let MPs out when the House is sitting. And so for me, this is not only going to be a fascinating discussion in my new role as the Associate Minister for the Environment, but also it's an opportunity for us all to participate in what is, I think, a very important part of the whole threatened species conversation, and that's really about what do we do on private property? How do we cope with maintaining, enhancing and protecting our threatened species on private land that makes up so much of the country? I need to just tell you that, or remind you, because I'm not sure how much of today's session has been live streamed, but we are now being live streamed on the DOC interwebby thing. So welcome to anyone and all of those that are listening or watching us being streamed. Your kind of streams, William? Probably. Electronic streams. So that's all good. The other hat that I wear is as Member of Parliament for Coromandel, and I never miss an opportunity to highlight the beauty and attractiveness of my part of the world. The wonderful thing about being the MP for Coromandel is that almost all New Zealanders know of or have at some stage visited the peninsula and enjoyed some of the natural splendour and beauty that we have. And I'm delighted to see some local constituents here who have formed the Hauraki Coromandel Predator-Free Working Group, and they've put together an incredible plan that is going to bring together the many small groups that have for years been trapping, killing, monitoring and working to ensure that predators are kept under some kind of control around the peninsula. And if I've seen one really terrific thing come out of the whole Predator-Free 2050 program, it's been the empowerment and the permission that has actually been given to groups and individuals all around the country to just continue getting on with the work that they've been doing. And if the community groups in my part of the world are anything to go by, we've got a tiger by the tail, and one that is just in capturing and taking people's imagination really very, very fantastically. So without any further yak from me, let me introduce our panel. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to ask the panellists to each talk for just a few minutes and give us the benefit of their wisdom and views on how they think that we can best be involved and engaged in private land conservation and issues relating to threatened species on private land. And then we're going to try and take questions from the floor and engage in a bit of a discussion, and we'll wrap this up at about 5:10. So Dr. William Rolleston is the President of Federated Farmers. He's a South Canterbury farmer. And he's got a lot of interest in the matters that we're talking about. Mike Jebson in the middle is the Chief Executive of the Queen Elizabeth II National Trust. And we had at Parliament just earlier this week, in fact just last night actually, a celebration to mark the 40th anniversary of the Trust and the wonderful work that they do on behalf of all New Zealanders in perpetuity. And then at the far end, is Ngaire Tyson. Ngaire is the project coordinator of the New Zealand Landcare Trust based in Northland, and Ngaire comes to this panel discussion with more than 15 years of hands-on experience leading and being involved in community conservation projects. And so I think we've got a great range of people who have some interesting comments and skills to go. So we didn't decide who was going to go first, so William, seeing that you are nearest to me, how would you like to kick off?
Now, does this work, or do I need this? I need this. Okay, thanks, Scott. And as he said, I'm William Rolleston, and I'm the National President of Federated Farmers. And I can assure you that the stream that's going out will be clean this afternoon. Look, I thought what I'd do is just do a bit of scene setting from the farmer's point of view, and go back to my own place. And sitting in our homestead is a specimen which is a laughing owl, and the laughing owl is now extinct. My grandmother found this specimen on the side of the road in 1914. No one had seen one for 20 years, and no one's ever seen one since. So it's recorded as the last known specimen in that species, and I think that's sad. We've, as a family, have looked for and followed up potential sightings of laughing owl, but none have been seen. So in terms of endangered species, it's right at our doorstep on our property. My grandfather, actually, my grandmother's husband, Dr. Woodhouse, was instrumental was actually the first farmer along the Hunters Hills to stop burning. And that relates to another story that in 2007, I was rung up by Lincoln University, and they said that they wanted to come and have a look at the spear grass that had grown since the burning had stopped, to see if the Canterbury knobbled weevil was there. And while one part of me was excited, another part of me said, well, what's going to be the impact? If they find this rare weevil on my property, what's going to be the impact for me? What restrictions might there be coming forward? And it was, I was surprised at that reaction, but it's probably a reaction that a number of farmers have. At the same time, being quite proud to be able to have something that is endangered on their farm and being able to nursery it, I guess. They didn't find one, but it makes the point about that reaction that farmers have. And I think farmers are fundamentally, and Dan really said this, are conservationists. They're custodians of, as he said, about 58% of New Zealand's land. And many of them live on the farm because they like to be in nature. They don't want to live in the city. And many of them have an intergenerational view, just as Māori do, about their properties and about conservation. And I think, Mike will talk about the QEII Trust, but I make the point that actually conservation on farm goes well beyond the 180,000 hectares that have been put into QEII covenants that we celebrated last night. As a public, you want to look at what regulation, what approaches you can take, regulation is one approach, and we've seen a lot of regulation come at us as farmers, and the problem with regulation is that it makes farmers feel threatened, and it makes farmers feel threatened about their property rights. And my experience of having been president of Federated Farmers for the last 3 years is that farmers hate being told what to do. They absolutely hate it. But if you give them a problem, they want to solve it. And so I think this is a challenge about the conversation we have with farmers. And again, Dan alluded to that. It's about the conversation we have with farmers to get to the end, not just telling farmers what to do. And in fact, farmers often work with conservation groups. In my area in Timaru, we ganged up with Forest and Bird to protect funding for the biodiversity officer who was doing assessments of SNAs around South Canterbury. But they were doing it by approaching farmers and having a conversation with farmers rather than peering over the fence and then writing them a notice saying that the stream had to be protected. And the success of that was incredible, and that's why Federated Farmers and that group got together. And, again, our missions can align. I take my hat off to Doc for their efforts in getting rid of the great white butterfly, which was an incursion in Nelson. Would have cost farmers about $50 million a year, but it also threatened native watercress. And while MPI at that point, I think it was MAF, stood back, Doc came to the fore and this year announced that actually they had eradicated that incursion. And so, with myrtle rust coming along, we would hope that might have a similar outcome, but I think the challenge, as we all know, is far, far greater from that point of view. So just finally, in terms of that aligning our visions, farmers are spending $50 to $60 million a year on possum eradication, and that's because we want to eradicate TB from these islands. And there's a window of opportunity because we will eradicate TB before we eradicate possums, and that funding stream and that those goals won't align anymore. But I think there's an opportunity to look at other technologies, and I'm sure you've talked about gene drive in terms of dealing with predators that can actually take that forward. And if we can crack that sort of technology, then I've got a whole bunch of high country farmers who do care about the land, who spend thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars dealing with pests, who actually want to use that technology for rabbits. So it's not just about pests. So I know I've done my time, but I think it is about working together, about agriculture and conservation, aligning their values and their goals, having the conversation in the right way, and finding paths which meet seemingly conflicting agendas. Thanks.
Thank you very much, William. Now let's go straight to Mike, QEII Trust.
Thank you very much, Scott. I actually just want to pick up on a theme from William in terms of what he's been talking about. So last night, QEII was celebrating 40 years, and it's 40 years of partnership with landowners and what they can achieve on their land. And one of the things we did last night, it was 40 years, we wanted to look at what our landowners were doing, the sort of generosity when you set the right environment for landowners to respond. So we released this report last night. There's a few copies available over at the table, but anyone who wants to get it. What this has done for the first time has quantified that commitment of landowners. So over the last 40 years, landowners have committed on average 2 areas every week for 40 years for permanent protection. So we now have a network driven by landowners of 4,300 covenants, 180,000 hectares. Now this is in the 70% of New Zealand most at risk from loss of biodiversity because there's been the biggest changes. So what we've been talking about is trying to secure the last remnants. And you set the right environments and landowners step up and they do it. And when they do it, they can be incredibly generous. Just to give you some idea of that, the average covenant in terms of what this report from Waikato University has found, landowners are spending about $64,000 per covenant on average to get the protection established. $64,000, that's serious coin. Every year on average, they're spending about $6,000 on maintenance, enhancement, pest weed, fence maintenance to try and protect that covenant. And the other significant cost that landowners have taken on board is the fact that they've decided to forego other economic uses of that land to put it into a covenant. And that, in fact, is some of the biggest costs faced by landowners. It's not an obvious cost, but it's a decision by the landowner because they think it's the right thing to do, because the environment has been created that they are embracing what's on their land. So I think that's really, really great. The challenge, of course, for us is keeping up with that demand because the demand from landowners who want to continue to do that is not going away anytime soon. There's lots more areas being offered to QEII to covenant every year. That's a challenge. The other challenge for us is, and we've been talking about it for the last 3 days, is the pest and weed issues. So covenants are a really, really effective method to protect land from humans. But the challenges that many of these places are facing, as we've heard, is the pests, the weeds, climate change, adverse events, fire, floods, the whole range, that we've heard about the last few days. So in the next 40 years, and starting to last night, QEII is looking to see what more it can do to support the active management of covenants once they're established, because currently most of the burden is falling on the landowners themselves. And with some of these challenges, we know some of our landowners need new technologies, new help, because of the costs and the challenges in front of them.
Thanks, Mike. And now we'll go to Ngaire Tyson, New Zealand Landcare Trust. Over to you, Ngaire.
Thank you. Well, I think it's been a good lineup because I think we're just nicely feeding into each other. I couldn't agree more with what you've both said. So I'm Ngaire Tyson and I work for the New Zealand Landcare Trust, and it's my privilege to coordinate something we call the Kiwi Coast, and you might have seen the poster up on the wall over the last couple of days. The Kiwi Coast is a collaborative initiative that involves 87 entities, all working together. That's 72 land care groups or community groups, and we're working on creating New Zealand's first Kiwi corridor so that we have Kiwi free-ranging through Northland, wherever they please. We want them to be safe. We want them to go on little holidays, the Bay of Islands, Whangarei Head, back again, and that's going to be pretty neat. So we all work together, and I coordinate that, which is great. And collectively, we're now covering 125,000 hectares in Northland with pest control. And that's all community-led with the good support of agencies and organisations. I collate the pest control data from all those groups, the trap catch data, and we know that around 169,000 pests have been killed on the Kiwi coast in the last 4 years. That's only stuff that's been caught in traps. We have no idea about all the stuff that's been killed by toxins and gone away nicely to die tidily in their little hole somewhere. And is it working? Yeah, it sure is. In Northland, on the east coast, our Kiwi monitoring shows that our Kiwi numbers are slowly but steadily going up. So it's really cool. And sometimes not so slowly. We have one amazing project called Backyard Kiwi, which have taken their Kiwi from 80 to over 812 years. They're on a peninsula, so this is one of the ideas. Those Kiwi are going to be spilling out, and as they spill out into the next area, we're encouraging and supporting those communities to be ready and to have that nice and safe so those Kiwi can keep going. I crunched some numbers last year and we found that $1.75 million worth of resources were coming into the projects, coming into the area for pest control and Kiwi monitoring and all these bits and pieces. And amazingly, 34% of that was unpaid labour. And I realised at that time that's what my job is, to make sure that that unpaid labour, which we costed at just $20 an hour, we've got to keep that going. We've got to sustain those 72 groups, because this tiger by the tail, we've heard a lot over the last 3 days about how do we engage people, how do we get people on board with this. Well, once you get people on board and once you support them to look after their land and do what they want to do, well, there's no stopping them, and you've got to be ready to support them and enable them and ensure they've got the capacity and the skills that they need to do a really good job to get really good results. And there's no stopping these guys. There's no stopping these guys. So we've got to keep the funding going to these projects. Yet all the funding out there is limited in its timeline. And some funders will only let you come to them once. So what do you do when you've got projects that have been going 20 years and they've been to all the funders? Their Kiwi numbers are still going up, they're working really hard, it's all going really well, but the funder says, well, I'm sorry, you've already been to us once or maybe twice, go somewhere else. And the project says, we've been everywhere else. If we want good threatened species recovery, we need to sustain pest control over many, many, many years. And I guess that's my role to keep that going. Yeah, that's me.
Terrific, thank you, Ngaire. So now let's open it up a wee bit. Has anyone got a question or a comment that they might want to ask of any of our three panellists? Because I've got a couple of questions, and if no one else is going to have a go, I'm not going to miss the chance. Over here, is it? Devon, I think I can see in the... Yep. This is the exercise for the day.
Thank you. Thanks to the panel, and very interesting to hear from you. A lot of the talk at this conference has been about eradication. and that's a whole different game to the suppression that we're talking about at the moment. And I guess one of the questions that I'm really interested in is how do we get that conversation with landowners going that gets us to the point where we can be certain that when they want to sell their property, the next owner is also going to be committed to doing the good things they've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. My obtuse answer would be eradicate across the country, and then you won't have to ask that question. I think that's Sir Paul Callaghan's goal. The only way you would do that, and I, having made a comment about regulation, would be around regulation. But if I think about the wallaby situation in the Hunters Hills at the back of me, and I'm sorry to say that Federated Farmers was involved in getting rid of the Wallaby Board, and to me, I think that was a wrong decision, because what the Wallaby Board was able to do was to coordinate across properties an eradication scheme, or at least a suppression scheme, but it could fit with eradication as well. And what happens now in the sort of user pays world is that, you know, we might spend a whole lot of money on spreading 1080 to knock back wallabies, and the next weekend they will just come from the next door neighbours. So it needs more coordination. I think it needs to be driven with groups of farmers and getting groups of farmers to buy in, but having something over the top, just like you do with a lot of these environmental issues, having something over the top, a stick that you can wave at the end of the day. And I hesitate to say that, but if you want to get everyone to work in together, and the Wallaby Board was around, you know, a common rating, and then a requirement to take action.
Mike, Ngaire, do you want to have a go?
Yes, I do want to comment as well. In the case of covenants, we have about 300 covenants change ownership every year. You know, now that we've got 4,300, you know, land is being passed on to the next generation or sold on a regular basis. Part of our philosophy is getting in there early with the new owner, trying to get them out into the covenant with our very enthusiastic reps who can point out the special characteristics of that land, to try and get them to understand that they've got something special that's deserving of protection. The other thing is around the whole concept of covenants in a landscape. And one of the things we often find is a couple of leading farmers in a valley will put in a covenant, and then the whole ethos just spreads through the community. So even though that farmer then might change hand, the neighbour comes back who's also done a covenant and talks about the importance of it. So there's a really important matter of, you know, the social cohesion and discussing the challenges and the benefits and the values of what's in their land.
Ngaire.
Yeah, I think we're ready for eradication. We've got groups out there who've been working, you know, 20 years, every week out there checking the traps again and again and again and getting reinvaded. And some of the work we're doing is trying to link up one predator trapping network or pest control network with the next one, and we hope to see some real efficiencies. But we're more than ready for the new technology. We have community groups and farmer groups who are leading their own private 1080 operations with a lot of community support and buy-in. So yeah, we're ready. Someone please bring us the technology.
Okay, thank you. Over this side, more exercise.
Hi, I'd like to congratulate the panel, each of you, for your convincing descriptions of what you're doing. I'm just wondering, there's a lot of talk about family ownership of farms and intergenerational responsibility. I'm wondering if corporate ownership is going to change some of that dynamic, and what may, if it is, what may be able to be done.
I think the driver between, or the driver for intergenerational custodianship is, you know, we understand that on the family farm, but I think if you look at corporates, and we heard it from Meridian, they look at it not intergenerationally, but they look at it as their social responsibility, social corporate responsibility. So I think the outcome actually ends up to be the same, but the drivers are different.
In our case, Landcorp is the biggest corporate farm owner in the country. It's also got the largest number of covenants of any individual organisation. There's over 160 covenants. It's part of their ethos in terms of what they're doing. So it's very much dependent on the corporate, but more and more corporates are looking at the triple bottom line and their accountability to their markets in terms of what they're doing. So there is that, economic driver for them to do this as well. It's not just the social driver.
The only thing I would add is that I think everyone's got a part to play in this. It's got to be about whether it's corporate farmers or lifestylers or people in the cities. Everybody's got a role to play, and we've all got to work together if we're really going to do this.
Time for maybe one more, if there is one. Over here, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to congratulate the panel for some really insightful views, and particularly Ngaire. You raised the issue about sustainability of these programs. It's both financial sustainability, governance sustainability, and on-the-ground sustainability. So we've got to get this right, because this is forever. So any views on how you might do it?
Do you want to start, Ngaire?
Yeah, so I've got some crazy ideas. I'm not that ambitious, but I'm a bit crazy. I'm fascinated by the willingness of people in New Zealand to go out and do a hell of a lot of volunteer work all the time, and I want to see it valued, and I want to see that sustained. So I'd like to see unpaid voluntary labour, especially around pest control, actually valued. And for my crazier idea that I've been talking to some people about is that groups, once maybe they've been working in an area for 5 years, maybe can build up a pest control credit for every hour they're out there checking traps or repairing their fences or looking after the land, doing species recovery or monitoring. They could build up a pest control credit that could be valued at $20 an hour. End of the year, council, whoever looks back and says, yep, you've got $1,000 worth of pest control credit. What do you need? Bait stations, traps, true cards, what do you need? So because that would once again mean that groups and iwi and hapu are in the driving seat. They'd be really interested in keeping all their landowners engaged in that, and they wouldn't ever be fearing about how am I going to do next season's rat control? Where's my monitoring stuff coming from? I need some more transmitters. They would know the resources were going to be going as long as they were keeping up their work. So I'm just posing that to our Northland Regional Council at the moment and having those discussions. So yeah, watch the space.
Mike.
QEII has been quite lucky that over the last 40 years we've had very good bipartisan support from across governments of all stripes in terms of the work we do. That's given us good base funding to support our covenanters. We've also increasingly getting support from regional councils because they see the core role that permanently protected lands are helping in terms of their biodiversity responsibilities. But there's more that needs to be done, and so part of our mission at the moment is to really explain the challenges that our landowners are doing, the fact that they're already doing huge investment, but it's not enough, and they need more support from the wider community. So that's what we're trying to build on.
And William.
I think if you're going to try and encourage people to invest and have a sustainable outcome, then you can't think that people are going to make that investment if they think it's going to go on forever. And I think we need to work smarter and not faster. If we're really going to achieve eradication of predators by 2050 or at any time, then we're going to need to use all the tools in the toolbox. And we've heard a lot about some of the tools, and we're using a lot of the tools. But I think if you're really serious, then conservationists, Māori, and scientists need to have a conversation with New Zealand about genetic technologies and the use of genetic technologies to actually get rid of the last predator in New Zealand. And without it, we won't achieve it. But with a goal, then the enthusiasm to invest will be much, much greater.
And that seems like a timely place to draw this panel discussion to a close. Just hearing talk about the role that volunteers have to play, and again putting in a plug for the beautiful Coromandel. One of the interesting things about Coromandel is that we have, in terms of age demographic, the second most mature aged electorate in the country. So we've got a very big group of people in that plus 60 age group, and many of them are hugely committed to voluntary, active work. Pest eradication and control is a very big volunteer aspect on the peninsula. Long may it continue, but I think Ngaire's points about how do we acknowledge that, how do we represent that in some kind of tangible, meaningful way that doesn't just rely on people's goodwill. But I can assure you there is a huge, not only a physical and time investment, but it's what I like to call an emotional investment that is put in by literally thousands of people all around the country, and it's no better represented in my view than in my home patch. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this afternoon. Will you join with me please in thanking William and Mike and Ngaire for what I think has been a very interesting discussion. Thank you.